What is up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Today, Randy and I are going to be talking about some. Got something going on in the background there, Randy. Technical difficulty start us out, but what is up, guys? Excited to talk about the number one mistake that good anglers make, tournament anglers make. I have a recent discovery that I've made based on a small sample size of my recent fishing trips, and I kind of want to share this insight with you that I picked up from my personal experience, and then try to use Randy's 30 years of tournament bass fishing experience to fill in the gaps of my theory and hopefully give you guys some really good information by the end of the stream. Randy, how's it going tonight?
Doing good, and I've got a lot of information to share because I've made a lot of mistakes in 30 years of tournament fishing. I can promise you. But every one of those mistakes, you always learn something from it. So it's never for naught in that.
For sure, and same here. So excited to kind of pick your brain on this and break it down. Before we get into that, a couple things. Just want to say hi to everyone on the stream. We got Robert, Kobe, Gene, John, Chad, Travis, Ryan. How's everyone doing tonight? A couple housekeeping things before we get started. First up, guys, apologize for missing the live stream last week. I was actually on vacation. I was at the CrossFit Games up in Wisconsin, so my wife and I like to do CrossFits. That's what we went up there, took a little vacation, visited some family up in Wisconsin, and it was a nice time. So, thanks for bearing with us for the missed live stream, but hopefully you guys had some more content to watch on the Fish the Moment channel, also on Randy's channel. So that was just one thing there. And then another thing that I wanted to do is choose the winner from the live stream 2 weeks ago for our giveaway for the Bridgeford beef jerky. Every single week on the podcast and on the live stream, we give away a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky. Bridgeford's our title sponsor for the podcast. Huge shout out to them. They make some of the best beef jerky on the market, and it's crazy, Randy. It's so funny. There's so many guys on Facebook, on email, everything that say that they've gone out and bought some Bridgeford beef jerky on a recommendation from the live stream, and they say it's the best jerky they've ever had. So I'm glad that people are enjoying it. We wouldn't take on a sponsor here if we didn't fully believe in the product. I didn't have a live stream sponsor for over 90 episodes because I wanted to get a good one, and this is definitely one that we believe in for sure.
Yeah, it's addicting, man. I don't think once you eat a piece of it, you wind up eating the whole bag. I don't know anyone that just eats a couple pieces and puts it down. So just don't take our word for it. Give it a try and let us know what you think on that.
For sure. And from the live stream a couple weeks ago, we did a comment on basically asking you guys to comment what your favorite new bait was from iCast. So iCast was a couple weeks ago, and there was a bunch of new baits that came out. And the comment winner that I picked for that last live stream is Jessica Eaton, or Aiton. I don't know how to pronounce that, Jessica, but Jessica, she said, the new Rapala DT8 is my pick. It's going to be a great in-between bait. And I think that Rapala DT8 looks really, really cool. Excited to kind of get a new lineup in that DT series. Don't use the DT baits as much as I probably should be, but I'm definitely excited for that one. There's a bunch of other baits that came out of iCast too, so definitely check those out. But Jessica, you're the winner from our Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. So just head over to, or just send us an email at info@fishthemoment.com and just let us know your shipping address, and we'll have Bridgeford mail you out a 12-pack of Bridgeford beef jerky to your house. So congratulations on winning that, and we're going to be picking another winner at the midpoint of this live stream, so definitely stay tuned for that. So that is all I have, Randy, for the housekeeping items here. Anything else before we jump into my new theory that I've been working on?
I heard. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe somebody on the feed knows this, but I heard at iCast they came out with a new forward-facing sonar that they call intuitive angling.
Really?
Which is, I think that's what somebody sent me a couple comments on my YouTube feed. It's called intuitive angling or something, and it shows a 3D image of all the cover in front of the boat. I saw some pictures of it. I didn't know if that was just somebody who was just saying that or if that was any truth to that.
Oh, I think that's just. I don't think it's actually forward-facing sonar. I think it's just it's a mock-up of some stuff that I don't think it's actually. it's
It's
very
not a real
far
thing.
away from being real. I did see that. I don't think that that's coming anytime in the near
Okay.
future. But
I say, yeah, we'd have to do some more, or I'd have to do some more railing on it, like a live scope, if that was the case.
yeah, I don't think anything right this minute. So you can save your rant for at least a couple of years. I feel like it's a couple of years out, especially for the bass fishing market. I think it's a European company or something like
All
that.
right, okay.
Something like I don't think it's actually forward facing sonar. I think it's something different. But we'll get into that if that ever becomes a real thing. But
Yeah.
we'll kind of stay grounded in reality here to start off, also to keep you from leaving the stream in a fit of rage. We don't want that either. So good deal. Well, in that, and Jay said it's augmented reality. Basically, yeah, the guy what Randy's talking about. There's a thing where you can put your phone up, and it'll show you where the contour lines are on the lake with your phone, going like this. So it's. I don't know if it's going to actually happen. It probably will at some point, but I don't know actually how helpful that would be, honestly, either. I think it's just easier to read a contour map, to be honest, but that's just me. Anyways, let's jump right into it. So basically, Randy, what I wanted to talk about on this live stream is a theory that I came up with about how really good anglers, tournament anglers, or just really good fishermen who fish the same lake for years and years, maybe guys who fish multiple times a week, how these anglers struggle to actually catch fish because of an overload of information. And I want to kind of go through this with you because I think it's actually going to give a lot of your weekend anglers who maybe can only fish once a week or maybe even once every other week a little beam of hope that they can be competitive in tournaments or they can just catch really good fish just like the tournament anglers out on the professional tours or whoever the best anglers are out there, the best locals. And I'm going to explain what I'm talking about here and how then the average fisherman who's just going out a couple days a month can take this information and apply it to their fishing. So I'm just going to share my screen here really quick and pull up a couple lakes, a couple examples. So if you guys watch the main Fish the Moment YouTube channel, you'll see that Randy and I do these challenges, Randy versus me. Our first one was on Stockton Lake over here in Missouri. And I'd never fished Stockton Lake in the springtime before. We'd fished it one other time for a challenge, but I think I've only fished Stockton Lake like 2 or 3 times in my entire life. And we launched down here, and I had no idea where to go, what to do, where to catch fish. And honestly, I started my day by running from the boat ramp here up the lake like 3 miles. I pulled into a pocket here. I was like, oh, the water looks not right here. And I ran all the way back down like 5 miles down to a pocket over here. So I didn't start fishing for like the first hour. I was just running around looking at water. And I ended up catching about 13 and a half, almost 14 pounds on this fishing day with no practice, no information, just using my instincts to catch fish. We then went out to Table Rock Lake the next month. And I actually did go out on Table Rock Lake and do a little bit of fishing before our challenge. And I took a buddy out. We went fishing for a while, caught a few fish, but I kind of had a little bit of an idea what the fish were doing. This was actually the worst challenge I've had so far against Randy. It was the one challenge where I actually fished a couple days before we actually filmed the video. And I basically got caught up in a pattern fishing some offshore areas and different places where I thought the fish were going to be stacked up. And I just couldn't get them to bite on the bait we were trying to throw and the conditions we were trying to fish. I finally got out of my stubbornness about 2/3 of the way through the day, ran over to some channel swing banks, and ended up putting 3 fish for a little over 8 pounds in the boat, missed a few fish, and had a decent chance of catching the limit, especially if I had been less stubborn. We then, actually I did a challenge myself on Grand Lake over here. No practice again, no information, nothing. Ran around the lake, ended up catching 15 pounds of fish in that challenge. All these videos are on the main Fish the Moment channel if you guys want to check that out. Came to Table Rock Lake again, no practice, caught 15 pounds without any information, just basically going out day of. And I did it again on Beaver Lake. I'm going to post that challenge video here in the next week or so. Caught 15 pounds for 5 bass on Beaver Lake with no practice, no information. Doing this over and over again has kind of made me question, okay, why am I ever practicing for tournaments? Especially when I used to fish tournaments back in the day. Why am I going out and pre-fishing for tournaments? And I remember a very specific example from Beaver Lake where I actually had a tournament that I was trying to fish for college. College fishing it was one of the last few college fishing tournaments I ever fished. And I practiced for 2 days for this event. It was a championship event. Practiced for 2 full days. Went out on the lake and tried to find those fish all over the lake. found a few patterns, kind of felt like I knew what was going on, went out tournament day and didn't catch anything. I think I caught like 2 fish for 3 pounds. It was terrible. And I had caught them in practice. I knew what the fish were doing, but the conditions changed a little bit and it threw me off completely. I was focused on the patterns I found in practice, and those patterns were disappearing and there were new patterns emerging. And so what happened is that I basically bombed that tournament, but I went back a week later and I fished on a Saturday for the tournament, and I also fished the next Saturday. And I was so frustrated that I spent 2 full days of practice and a tournament day out there, and I couldn't even catch a limit of fish. It was really, really frustrating. Well, the next week I went back out on Beaver Lake, rolled up to the dam area of the lake, which I hadn't visited in practice, and I just said, you know what, I'm just going to go to a new area of the lake where I have no knowledge, no information. I'm just going to go and fish and just kind of go off my instincts, fish the moment. And I rolled up here, Randy, and I caught like 13 pounds in 5 hours on the north end of Beaver Lake. Same conditions. The fish were pretty much in the exact same mood. The weather hadn't changed that much or anything. And the only reason that I caught him better is because I basically just fished free. There were other anglers all around me. There were other tournament boats. That wasn't the issue. It was that I was so caught up in my practice about catching them on secondary points halfway back in these creeks that I ran every single secondary point halfway back in the creek for like 6 hours in my tournament day. It didn't catch him. And I caught him so well in practice doing that, I tried to force it. I would try to fish him with a jerkbait, a crankbait, a jig, a Ned rig, all these different things, and they just weren't biting. But up on this part of the lake, I came up here and it was just easy. It was simple. I just picked up a crankbait and just started running chunk rock banks and just catching them and catching them and catching them. And I just think that the reason for that is because my mind was completely open to all possibilities. I was letting all of the nature elements get into my brain, seeing the wind, seeing the cloud cover, where the other fishermen were. And that open mind allowed me to catch a lot more fish. And if we take a look at my recent challenge videos, every single video we've done on the Fish the Moment channel where I've had no practice, I've caught over 13 pounds for 5 fish. The one challenge where I actually did go out and practice and had some preconceived notions, I didn't even catch a limit. So that's kind of my working theory in the sense that maybe practice fishing or going out and catching fish before the tournament is actually more harmful at times than helpful. And honestly, I find that it's probably more harmful than helpful most of the time, regardless of whether you're fishing shallow or offshore. So that's my hypothesis, Randy. What do you think?
Man, this is such a great topic because I can relate to it so heavily being a tournament angler because I've spent more days practicing for tournaments than I have actually fishing tournaments over the past 30 years. And I can tell you guys something right now, there's a very, very fine line between success and failure as far as locating fish and catching bass. And it all boils down to decisions, like what Jonny was saying. And, here's the thing about that. It's like when you're practicing for a tournament, or you're practicing and you're trying to locate fish, there's a couple of different elements you got to take into consideration. You have to decide, you have to be able to read the potential that an area has to produce. And you have to make the decision, do I want to commit to this one way of fishing and find the water that I need to basically run this pattern, or do I want to be versatile? If this isn't working, do I want to switch up and change something else? So, and here's the thing about it, that both of those things can work. Let me use an example right here. Let's say I'm flipping a jig, and say I go up the river at Beaver Lake there, and I'm flipping isolated laydowns or something like that, and I get 5 or 6 bites in one day of practice. Now, I'm not getting many bites, but maybe those are quality fish and it takes me all day long to get them. So at that point, do I say, okay, do I just need to stay with this pattern and keep looking for this type of water? And I've got to commit to it and stay all day long fishing it. And I'm going to get 5 or 6 bites. Or do I need to abandon this because I may only get 2 or 3 bites? Do I need to switch gears and fish something completely fresh the next day? That's the big $64,000 question everybody asks on there. And I've seen it both work. Like I said, I've seen times one works. I've seen times you got to bail out. But in my personal experience on that, it's like I sort of give everything like a 15, 20-minute rule. I'll try something for 15 to 20 minutes. If that's not working, I'll either switch areas, switch techniques. And I think what we want to talk about here in today's live stream is what what is it that enables you to make that decision? What is that right decision to make?
And I guess a question for you, Randy, in your practice days, how often do you catch fish on a pattern that you find in practice? Let's say you practice for an open for 3 full days, and you're catching 12 to 15 pounds in practice every day. How often do you then go and catch 12 to 15 pounds in the tournament off the patterns you find in practice?
Yeah, that is something that like that's all over the board because let's say, for example, you're fishing a chatterbait in grass down in Florida, like a Lake Toho or Lake Okeechobee. You've got a solid offshore chatterbait bite going. You're getting, every single day of practice, you're getting, 12 or 15 bites. In a situation like that, where you're fishing an area where there's a group of fish, there's a pretty good chance that unless you have some type of a radical weather change, that you're going to get those same type of bites over a sustainable period. Some patterns that I found out, there's some patterns are a little bit more sensitive than others. Some can withstand something. But another thing, let's say in practice, like you're talking, Jonny, say if I practiced for 3 or 4 days in a row and I caught them the first 2 hours in the morning, I caught good limits every morning fishing a Zara spook on a main lake point the first 2 hours. And I feel it was pretty reliable. And then the first day of the tournament goes out there and something changes. There may be the wind may have switched directions a little bit. The water may have rose or fell down a little bit, and you don't get those fish to bite. So it happens a lot. I mean, very seldom, from what I've found, that I don't think things unfold exactly the same in practice as they do in the tournament, because you're talking about most of the time a week period. And bass are constantly changing. They're constantly moving. And for something to hold up exactly the same for a week, it's extremely rare to do so. You just don't see that very often. There's always some type of adjustments you have to make. Those adjustments that either need to be area oriented or technique oriented, or maybe a little bit of both. But man, to answer your question, I look back over those past years, and there's just been a handful of times where things clicked in practice, and then in the tournament they clicked the same. Most of the time for me, what I found is if I pull into an area in practice and say I can just put my trolling motor down and I keep it down in the water all day long, and I'm fishing one area that's got a lot of territory to it, a lot of cover to it, where I don't have to move and jump around. There's a lot of fish in one area. Those are the areas that can produce even after you catch them in practice. But if you're running a pattern, if you're skipping around, if you have something that's really technique or oriented specific, those are the things that really rarely hold up over a long period of time.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting tidbits for you, Randy, just off your personal experience from the last these last tournaments you fished this last season. I don't mean to throw you under the bus or anything, but I just want to go just kind of give a couple examples that I know. Sure. Talking from you. One tournament that just jumped into my head as we were talking about this was your tournament on Lake of the Ozarks. So you went out to Lake of the Ozarks, and I remember that you went the first day of that tournament, and you basically went out, ran way up the river to this area that you thought was going to be really effective, did some practicing up there, kind of knew what was happening around that area, and it was covered in boats and it just wasn't working very well, and you felt like you knew what the fish were doing. You tried to go catch fish the way you were catching them. It wasn't working. You then ran back the second day and just stayed around the dam, an area where you knew the fish were going to be, and you just went fishing. You didn't really even bother, you didn't know where any spots were. You just used your instincts and relied on your, what you've learned from your entire career, and you end up catching a really good bag of fish. And if you had caught that bag 2 days in a row, you would have almost made the cut. Same thing happened to Lake Cumberland, if you remember as well. First day, struggled on the first day, did what you were doing in practice, and the fish just weren't doing quite the right thing. Second day, you completely abandoned what you were kind of doing, went back to a pattern that you had confidence in, and you caught one of the biggest bags of the tournament. And if you, again, had done that both days, you potentially may have won the tournament. So in my mind, I'm thinking, would you have been better off going to Lake of the Ozarks and just driving around the lake and seeing what part of the lake looks the best for me in terms of what I like to do and not fish at all, versus fishing and then maybe throwing yourself off? Like, oh, you go to the bottom part of the lake and you don't get bit for 4 hours. Well, you know you like that water. You know that's what you like to do. And you let that 1.5 day of practice mess up your entire flow. And I'm not saying that happened, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Like, do you think that going out and not practicing at all, not making a cast, might be a better option for you?
You know, that I'm fascinated by that concept because I know that you're really good at that. I mean, because you've told me stories about when you fished, tournaments earlier in your career. I mean, you just didn't practice at all and you did really good in the tournament.
Mm-hmm.
For me, and for a lot of tournament anglers, that's very intimidating to be able to think that you're just going to roll out there, not have any practice, especially if you don't know the lake very well, and have a good tournament. And it's like, I think that the more we see how this unfolds, and you made a good point about, a lot of times after I have a bad first day, I come back with a good second day because you're open-minded and you just let it flow. If we could get the courage to do that from the start, I agree with you. I think that our results could be a lot better. But that being said, at the same time, that is so difficult to do because I've tried that a little bit, and sometimes it clicks and sometimes you get on something real quick and you can run that pattern the rest of the day. But you have to be able to get those bites to point you in the right direction in order for it to do that. I think that I would love to be able to take one season and like not even practice and just go out the first day of the tournament and just like you said, fish with your instincts, fish what you think the fish are doing at the time and see how it unfolds. But I got to tell you, I'm just like that thought just sort of like is very intimidating to me as a tournament angler to do that. And there are some situations there's some situations where you have got to have some practice because say, for example, if you're fishing a place like the Sabine River that has, backwater sloughs 90 miles from the takeoff or something like that, yeah, you're going to have some practice just to logistically put yourself around those fish. And then if you have another lake, like say, for example, Table Rock Lake, where there's fish all over the lake and it's easy lake to pattern, that's going to be a lot easier to do that. So I think a lot of it, Jonny, in my opinion, it depends on the type of fishery that you're on and the type of patterns and available options that the anglers have. I think in some situations it can be really good, but in some situations, let's say, for example, I'll use the New Orleans Delta where we had the Bassmasters Classic down at New Orleans several years.
Yep.
That's a vast body of water that has a lot of brackish water. It's got areas where you have redfish and bass mixed. It has endless big bays and sloughs, canals. It's a super complex body of water. And if you've never been there before, the odds of you going out and just fishing green from the start against somebody that knows how to run these little backwater sloughs 90 miles from the takeoff, you're probably going to get your butt kicked in a situation like that. So again, I think it's relative to the lake and the potential that it offers to a large degree.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's a couple of factors in there that really determine if you need to practice or not. I think one thing is obviously, do you have experience on a specific body of water? So for example, if I'm fishing on Lake Dardanelle, I'll pull up Google Earth here. If I'm fishing on Lake Dardanelle in central Arkansas, that's kind of a tricky lake to fish if you don't have a lot of experience on the lake. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be certain sections of this lake, certain backwater areas that just hold fish consistently. You have little backwater sloughs and stuff, like the back of Spasmer Creek that a lot of you guys know about and stuff, but there's little key sweet spots in there. And in those situations, it's very helpful to know that the fish are setting up right back in this little slough and you can pull right in there and catch those fish in one little backwater area. And it's kind of like a boat race to get to those areas. But at the same time, I remember a lot of times when I would roll into those areas and there'd be so much fishing pressure there that I would run my first 2 or 3 areas where I was getting a lot of bites and not catch any fish. But what I did instead is like halfway through a day, I would abandon all the areas that I felt like I knew where the fish were. I would then start running old areas that I knew the fish were setting up in the past. Like, for example, I remember one tournament where I just decided to run way back in the back of Dardanelle or Delaware Bay here, and no one was fishing back in Delaware Bay, but there was like some lily pad stems back up in here, and there were some isolated stumps. And I hadn't practiced in there at all. I just knew that this was a good area that held a good concentration of fish. I then just got back in this creek for the last 4.5, 5 hours of the day, just fished my instincts, and ended up winning the tournament just because I found a pattern. They were on isolated random stumps in the middle of this flat, and I was flipping a lizard to them. And like that worked out. And I was so flustered the first half of the day because every single spot I ran to was covered in boats. And I had found fishing there in practice, and it just wasn't working for me. And the only time I feel like I've ever had a tournament is actually on Lake Dardanelle as well. The only time I've ever had a tournament where I felt like my practice helped me win the tournament was when I was fishing a college regional championship on Dardanelle, and I found one isolated shell bed on a ledge, and I graphed like 2 full days before the tournament, and I found one little isolated shell bed that was way off the, an obvious ledge, but it was kind of off the beaten trail, and it was loaded, and that's where I caught my fish, was on a little, drop, a little shell bed area. That's the only time where I've actually seen the fish, like, I guess I've ever practiced in a way that's allowed me to win the tournament, because I found a very specific group of fish on an isolated piece of cover. That's the only time I can think of doing that, though. Most of the time when I fish tournaments and stuff like that, I would find those areas, and by tournament day, they wouldn't be any good. And I would just start randomly graphing again and find a new spot during the tournament and catch my fish there. And to what Randy kind of mentioned before, after a while, I just stopped practicing altogether. For the last, probably a year and a half of my college fishing, I didn't practice ever for any tournaments, because I had school, so I was basically showing up to tournaments and just fishing. And I would do so much better in all my tournaments when I would literally just show up, fish day of, and pick a creek and figure it out, whether it was shallow, offshore, whatever it was. And I just basically knew I like to fish 3 or 4 different ways. I either like to fish offshore brush piles, I like to crank ledges, I like to throw a jig in grass, or I like to throw a buzzbait. Whatever my 4 or 5 confidence techniques were. And I just went and found water like that, and I just fished. And it worked out so much better for me than knowing exactly before I went into the tournament which banks I want to fish, which stretches of water I want to fish. Because also, a thing that used to get to me is I used to have a really bad problem where if anyone was fishing around me in my area, I would get freaked out. Like, if anyone was pulling up on my bank before I got there, I'd be like, oh man, they're on my bank. And then I run to another spot, oh, they're on my bank. And I have all these spots that I plan on fishing. And after you run to 3 or 4 spots and they're covered up with boats, you get frustrated. You get kind of discouraged. And I realized that I just can't do that to myself. I just have to run the water that's open, the water that's available, and trying to find patterns and not worrying about what everyone else is doing. Focus on the spots that are available and maximizing those. So that's kind of long-winded, but what are your thoughts on all that, Randy?
Yeah, I agree with that completely, Johnny. I'll give you guys a good example. From my perspective on that is we have a Bassmaster Open at Grand Lake coming up this October. And I know Grand super well, and I could probably go to that tournament with 0 practice and do as good as if I practiced for a week there, because I know how the tournament's probably going to get won. I know the half a dozen key locations is probably going to get one in. So from that standpoint, it's all about isolating and refining the technique within that water in order to maximize the time you spend. Say, for example, they could be on docks, they could be on laydowns, they could be on points, and probably on all that type of stuff. You just have to know how much time to spend on each one of those things. So if you're fishing a lake that you're familiar with, it's all about figuring out what's working at that particular time so you can spend all your time doing it. Then I'll go to another tournament the week after that Grand Lake tournament. We have I've got the Toyota Series Championship at Lake Pickwick in October, the end of October. And even though I fished Pickwick a lot, there's a lot more things that could be working there, and there's a lot more unknowns. So from that standpoint, I need more practice, because I don't know whether I should be fishing on the lower end of the lake or up at the tail race. I don't know if I should be fishing shallow flats offshore, or if should be fishing water willows shallow. You've got to have that extra practice on the water that you're really not that sure of on there. But at the same time, and I talked about this actually. I did a video on my YouTube channel today about that. It's all about, for me, it's you got to sort of isolate and narrow one part of the lake down. I think another thing that you can do as far as it spins people out, as far as their practicing time, is they try to cover too much water with that. So the more that you can really narrow that down a little bit more, the more odds you have of just going out the day of the tournament with no practice and catching them.
Well, and here's just another kind of thought process or a thought experiment for you, Randy, because I feel like this is something that we probably should test out in a video or something, because I think this could be interesting. But if we go out to, let's say, Beaver Lake again here. This is where I just did my challenge. I'll be posting the video on the main Fish the Moment channel. And I caught 15 pounds on Beaver Lake in July, which is pretty good. It would have finished top 3 in a 150 boat tournament like the week before. So really good bag of fish. And basically what I did is I launched way down here by the bridge by this War Eagle, or I don't even know what it's called, the river down here. And I don't fish Beaver Lake hardly at all because it's just such a tough fishery usually. But I found that it was actually a lot easier to catch fish on beaver when I just went out with an open mind, because what I basically did is I went out thinking I'm going to catch them offshore. I don't know how I'm going to catch them offshore. I don't know the depth they're going to be in, anything like that. I just knew that I wanted to catch them offshore. So I launched the boat here, and it took me about 2.5 hours of graphing up and down this river, and I had to go way up until I got into the mouth of the War Eagle River here before I found my first school of fish. I literally graphed for 2 hours-ish through several miles of the lake without finding anything. And I finally pulled up on the spot with my electronics, saw some fish, caught a couple fish in a hair jig, caught like 4 keepers pretty quick, then started running up the lake, and I basically was just running up the lake, going all over the place, just graphing random points, random areas that looked interesting, just real obvious stuff, like obvious drop-offs, obvious ledges. And I finally got to this ledge after another hour and a half of graphing, caught a 5-pounder right here off this ledge. I then kept rolling, caught another 2.5-pounder there, and I just kept graphing. And I ended up graphing for 5.5 hours of my 8-hour fishing day. Finally got to another channel swing point right here, caught another couple really solid fish, 3-pounders, and finished off my limit. And I only fished for 3 hours and graphed for 5 hours. And that really worked for me on that fishing day. Now, I know that's not for everyone, but that's how I like to fish, and it really worked out great. And I find that whenever I'm practicing for tournaments and graphing and stuff, I'll find a lot of schools of fish, but not all of them are active the day that I'm actually fishing. So, for example, when I graphed this day on Beaver Lake, I found like 10 schools of fish, but I only got bit out of 3 of them because 3 of the schools were active, 7 of the schools were inactive. Now, I would also reckon, Randy, that you would also have been able to catch fish on Beaver Lake because the lake was still 5 or 6 feet high, and I think that you could have also picked up a bait that you're confident in, like a big jig, and gone and flipped, and probably caught similar weight up this river on beaver without any practice, just because you know what to look for in these backwater or in these little creeks, on these flatter banks, whatever it is that you look for, you'd be able to catch them up shallow. But honestly, I feel like if I had practiced on Beaver Lake before I fished this challenge, I would have done worse than I would have the day of, because I would have tried to fish all of these 10 schools of fish that I found and wasted a lot of time fishing for inactive fish. And I feel like the same thing could have gone for you, Randy. Maybe you might go out to the lake, fish a bunch of trees, shake off 15 fish, roll back through those same stretches of bushes, and maybe not get nearly as many bites because you've already alerted them to your presence by shaking them off, or maybe they've gone to a little bit different type of tree the day you're fishing there. Maybe they're not on the willows, maybe they're on the hardwoods, or whatever it is. And I think that, I honestly think, Randy, with your experience and everything, you would catch fish better just going out fishing as opposed to practicing. And I think it's the same for me at this point too, just because of our years of experience. Do you agree with that? Is that false? What do you think? Is that crazy?
Yeah, here's what I think about that, and I will use the bushes for example. What you're talking about here, yeah. If you had 5 foot of water in the visibility in the bushes, I could have probably went to the bushes and got bites. There's no doubt. But here's where the practice helps in a situation like that. Even though that you got a lot of visible, obvious cover, it could be bushes, it could be docks, it could be stumps, laydowns, or whatever. And say you roll in there, and you just decide to fish, cold, just that particular day. You roll in there and you get a couple bites. and that's all fine and good. But here's the advantage that a practice period gives you in that. Say, for example, I pull up to a stretch of bushes on Beaver Lake, and maybe it looks like there's 300-400 yards of bushes everywhere, lots of cover. And I go down through there with like a half-ounce black and blue jig, and I get 2 or 3 bites in there. If I've got the time and practice, that's when I can cut off my hooks and I can experiment that with different sinker sizes. I could go to 3/8, I could go to 3/4, a half, an eighth, a quarter. I could experiment with creature baits. I could experiment with curly-tailed worms. I could experiment with a variety of different lure profiles, different colors, different line sizes. I could refine that down to a fine-tooth comb what those fish are actually wanting as far as what produces the better bites, what produces the numbers of bites. And that's the advantage and that's the luxury that practice gives you if you use that practice wisely. That's the whole thing about it. It's like using it wisely. It's the having that ability to refine that approach. But then again, like what we're talking about, what Johnny's talking about as far as fishing in the moment, that may be only good for that day.
Yep.
Say, for example, I fish down this section and I spend 6 or 7 hours on this row of bushes, and I've got it dialed in. And say they want a green pumpkin Z-hog on a 3/8 sinker with the tail dyed chartreuse or the tail dyed orange, and that's what they want. That's working that day. That doesn't mean it's going to work the next day. The light intensity could be different. You could have just a little bit more cloud cover roll in. You could have a 5 or 7 mile an hour wind variation change. You could have a couple inches of the water rise or fall. You could have some boat traffic muddying up the shoreline and change the water visibility at the time. There's so many uncontrolled variables that we have to deal with. And that is what I think.
Randy, also on that too, just to kind of, while you're talking about that, it's so fascinating because think about, you said earlier in the stream that you like the 15-minute rule. If something doesn't work for 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you'll give up on it. But if you smashed them in practice and you spent 2 days dialing in the bait, you're going to spend 3 or 4 hours with that chartreuse tail dyed Z-hog, even if they won't bite it, because you're like, man, they were biting it in practice so well, I'm going to stick with it. Where if you were in your practice mode or in your fishing the moment mode, you would have given up in that, and you would have maybe gone to a jig or a spinner bait or something different. And now you're wasting half your day because you dialed in something in practice that's no longer working. And now you're hurting yourself.
Absolutely. And you see, and that's the thing, that this is the mistake. This is the thing in tournament fishing or any fishing. It can bite you or it can cause you to win the tournament, is because you're assuming the fish are going to be doing the same thing. When we get on fish in practice and you get all excited and all pumped up, you're assuming those bass are going to be doing the exact same thing the next day. I can't count how many tournaments, guys, I've had where I have had an epic practice and I've just got them dialed in down to the finest detail, and I couldn't even sleep at night because I couldn't wait to get out there. And I get out there the next day and it's noon and I don't have a fish in the boat. That has happened to me lots of times, so you can't get locked into anything. And it's great if it happens like that. I mean, I've had some tournaments where everything that I found in practice unfolds perfectly in the tournament and it's all rosy and everything's great. But more times than not, it doesn't with that.
Well, I have a way to kind of balance it out. I think that we need to test either in like team tournaments. We need to do something, Randy. I think getting out of the team tournament or doing that. It's the reason I don't do tournaments that much, guys, is because it's so hard to film in tournaments. I can't bring a camera person with me, and like it's a nightmare. So maybe if Randy and I fish team tournaments, at least Randy can be fishing while I'm screwing around with the cameras or something. Yeah. So maybe we'll do something like that, Randy. That might be a good medium so that one of us at least has a line in the water. But let me kind of give you my thoughts on this. But before I do that, really fast, I want to remind everyone that we are going to be doing a Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway this week on the live stream. So you'll have a chance to win a 12-pack of Bridgeford beef jerky shipped straight to your house. The winner from this past 2 weeks ago live stream was Jessica Eaton. Make sure you send us an email at info@fishingmoment.com with your mailing address. And we will send that, we'll have Bridgeford ship 12 packages of Bridgeford beef jerky straight to your house. And for this week on the the comments if you want to enter in to win a case of Bridgeford beef jerky. All you have to do is go in the comments below and just let us know what your best practice tournament day was, or your best tournament practice was, or your worst tournament practice. And if you've never had fished a tournament or anything before, then maybe just let us know what your best fishing day ever was. But maybe for the guys who fish tournaments, let us know what your best tournament practice day was, where you absolutely crushed them and maybe you didn't get the right result, or your worst tournament practice day ever and you end up catching a ton of fish. So kind of tell us a little story, let us know. We kind of want to hear some opinions from you guys. This really helps out just giving us more insight on what we should be doing on the water as well. So we're trying to learn from you just as much as you guys are learning from us. So if you type that down in the comments of the main YouTube video, definitely do that. You'll get entered in to win a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky. So shout out to Bridgeford for the sponsorship. And then one other thing really quick before I dive into something that I think you guys are really going to like it, this theory that I'm kind of working on and putting together. But before we do that, one thing really fast is I want to remind everyone that we have just updated some more lake breakdowns on our website, fishmoment.com. If you go to our lake breakdowns page, I've been working hard getting some offshore lake breakdowns out, Randy. Got several more out this past week, and I have more coming. So I have these offshore lake breakdowns, 30 GPS waypoints that are you're able to put them straight onto your fish finder. I give you boat depth, casting depth, location descriptions, the conditions to fish these areas. They can go straight to your fish finder. And if you guys want some really good offshore areas on your lakes, definitely check out these summer lake breakdowns. I'll be doing them for the fall, the summer, all these different seasons, and there's more coming every single week. And you can also check out Randy's lake breakdowns as well if you want a little more help finding exactly where you should be fishing on a given lake. So that is that right there. And that is all for the shameless plugs. I'm going to get right back into it. So here's my thought, Randy. In practice, if you're going out and fishing, let's say on, let's pick a lake that kind of is a pretty big lake, because obviously there's some lakes that are smaller, some lakes that are bigger, but let's go to Sam Rayburn Lake. That's a pretty big fishery, a lot of water to cover there. If I was going out and I had time to practice on Sam Rayburn Lake, in my mind, what I would want to do is I want to first determine where do I feel the most comfortable on the lake. What I mean by that is if I go to Sam Rayburn and there's just water everywhere, I mean, it's like 30, 40 miles long. In my mind, if I was going to have any practice time going into a day of fishing, I would want to spend 90% of that practice time, let's say especially if I have to have one day, driving around the lake, finding out which creeks and coves and pockets I feel the most comfortable in. For example, whenever I've been to Sam Rayburn several times, the area of the lake that really sets up the best for my eye is actually down here on the lower end of the lake, down by the takeoff. It's deeper, it's a little bit clearer, there's a lot of rock, and that sets up a lot like our Ozark lakes. And I have always caught them really well on this lower end of the lake, where there's a lot less grass, there's a lot less aquatic vegetation. I just don't fish a lot of grassy lakes, and I feel like this is where I am the most comfortable. I feel like I can understand how to catch fish in many different ways on this part of the lake. I can either catch them on shallow rocky banks, there's offshore brush piles, there's offshore rock piles, there's shallow rock, shallow riprap, stuff that's similar to my lake. Now, for example, if you're a guy from Florida, maybe you would prefer to actually fish up the lake more, maybe back in some of these bays. Back in these bays, there's a lot more aquatic vegetation. And if you fish a lot of lakes with grass, maybe fishing in this big grassy bay is going to be a lot more productive, or make you feel a lot more comfortable, just because it's going to set up for patterns that are in your comfort zone. And then maybe if you like to fish real shallow, dirty water, maybe you want to run way up by the bridge up here and hopefully not knock off your engine, but then you can fish in some shallow flooded cypress trees. So like on a lake like Sam Rayburn, that's this big massive lake, there's areas of the lake that will set up for your strengths, and you need to find that area, at least in my opinion, and identify that first and foremost. Then what I would try to do is I would say, okay, in this area, there's a lot of different ways I can catch fish. I'm not going to try to fish every single way possible on my practice day, especially if I have like 1 or maybe 2 days of practice. Instead, I'm just going to try to find the hardest possible pattern, the pattern that allows me to have the best chance of maybe catching a mega bag of fish or like winning the tournament. On Sam Rayburn, that's probably going to be graphing some of these offshore areas out here, finding a loaded brush pile or a loaded rock pile or a shell bed or something that has a massive group of fish on it. The risk reward on this pattern is really, really high. So basically, if you go out to this area and graph for 6 hours, you may not find anything. You may find like one small school of fish, but you also might find a school of fish that's set up on a little turn here, and there's 30 pounds of fish sitting there, and you can catch them every single cast in deep diving crankbait. But the thing is that if they're not there, you still can fall back to this area that you found them in earlier, or this area that you're comfortable in, and then tournament day, you just fish the moment. You go out, you say, okay, I'm going to start running all the really good looking stuff for 15 minutes. Maybe fish a rocky point. Then go and graph this long ridge and see if there's some rock piles out there. Maybe graph some of these points to see if there's some brush piles. Run up to the shallow bank and fish a jig or something in some shallow bushes. Maybe run over here and crank some rocky banks. And develop a pattern the day of based on what the conditions are presenting themselves with. Instead of, in practice, trying to find those patterns, though, I'm not going to waste my time trying to find the easy patterns that you can find within an hour or two. I want to spend my entire time looking for the super hard to find, those like needle in a haystack sort of patterns. Because honestly, Randy, how many days in practice do you just go out and you get on a pattern within the first 2-3 hours of practice because it's a pattern that you're familiar with from another fishery, another lake, something you're comfortable with, and you go out and practice and you figure it out quickly? Well, if you can do it in practice, why can't you do that tournament day? And I guess the only reason that this strategy might be a little bit tricky for guys to adapt or adopt is the fact that you won't know necessarily where the fish are in this creek going into the tournament day. I feel like a lot of guys have this stigma in their brain that they want to know exactly where the fish are going to be biting before they go out to the lake. They want to know with certainty that they're going to be able to pull up on this bank and catch fish. Well, one thing I've learned about bass fishing is there is no certainty, and very rarely do you catch fish even day after day on the same bank. And it's kind of like one of those things where guys are trying to be too controlling. They're controlling the situation, trying to, make it so that they can predict the outcome or stack the deck in their favor. But fish are living creatures, and there's the natural environment and all these different things. And I feel like you have to almost let go of that need to control and feel like you have to know exactly what's going on, and kind of just give into your instincts. Let your natural understanding of bass fishing, your years of experience, let that take over as opposed to trying to control everything. That was kind of a big deal there, long-winded, but what do you think about all that, Randy?
I agree everything with that, Johnny. One thing I'll add to that is I think a lot of it too, when you're talking about finding fish the day of the tournament or finding fish in practice, a lot of it depends on how you're fishing. Because, guys, I can tell you right now, you got two different personalities of bass. You got these bass that will go after moving baits, and you got the bass that are reacting to slow baits. If you go out and practice, and it didn't matter if you practice or fishing for fun or whatever, but if you get on a good bite on a moving bait, I don't care if it's a swim bait, a spinner bait, a crank bait, whatever like that, buzz bait, you got a lot better chance of those fish not biting in the tournament or later in the week than you do if it's a slow bait. You will find that if you practice and you get something going like fishing a Cinco slow, a wacky rig, a drop shot, a shaky head, something like that, those fish stay a lot more stable in a variety of conditions than a moving bait does. And another thing is like, okay, let's say, for example, I'm fishing a tournament. I've got 3 days to practice. And the first day of practice, I catch a 25-pound bag on a big swim bait. Say I'm slow wobbling a mega bass, 8-inch mag draft, shallow, and I catch a mega bag of fish. That doesn't excite me at all because I know, number one, it's the first day of practice. Number two, I know how bait sensitive that fish are to certain lures. And I know how they don't stay on something like that for days and days and days. So if you get on something like that, your odds of success for it to be sustainable are pretty low. But if you go out and, like I said, you're pitching a weightless Cinco around boat docks, and you get 25 or 30 bites the first day of practice, there's a good chance that you're going to continue to get that many bites throughout the course of the tournament in a variety of conditions. I don't care if it's cloudy, if it's raining, if it's sunny, whatever like that. So uh, keep that in mind, because bass have different personalities as far as what generates the strike from them and how they're positioned. And that's why I'll use Rick Clunn and Larry Nixon as an example. That's why Rick Clunn is all over the place. He'll win a tournament and then he'll go for 9 tournaments in a row and finish last place. Where Larry Nixon, he grinds it out every day. He makes the cut. He's in the top 30 every tournament, because Rick Clunn fishes big spinner baits and big square bill crankbaits, and Larry Nixon drags a plastic worm all the time. So that's why Larry Nixon makes the championships every year and probably doesn't win a lot of tournaments, but he's there every year. And that's why Clunn wins a tournament every 2 or 3 years and then just does terrible the rest of the time, is because it's keying in on those personalities of bass. Some of them are sustainable. Some of them are just real vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's really good insight on the slow and the fast moving baits. That really is key. Do you think though, Randy, that you necessarily need to go fishing in practice to know if the fast moving and the slow moving bait is what's working? Because I feel like in practice the whole key is finding the area, finding where you should be fishing, as opposed to knowing exactly what and how to fish it. Because I think a lot of times you have to figure that out day of. It's probably hurts you more than helps you if you dial in an exact retrieve, an exact cadence, an exact color in practice, because most of that stuff changes regardless. I think that probably the reason that a lot of guys struggle with practice fishing is that they get too dialed in. They get too focused on what they've done in practice. And again, it's that need to control every element. They want to know going into their tournament day, I caught fish this exact way, and that way I'm going to be less nervous about putting up $100 to fish this tournament because I know exactly how the fish are biting. But then you go to the tournament, you do the exact thing you did in practice, and you never catch a fish. So it's like it almost hurts you more than helps you. That need to control is hurting people more than just letting go, fishing the moment, and just kind of going with the flow.
Yeah, and you can control what you do, but you can't control what everybody else in the lake is doing. Because, guys, one of the biggest factors as far as bass turning off and getting difficult to fish is fishing pressure, specifically from a large tournament. Bass will react; they react to fishing pressure, and just the increased boat noise is just like they do for a bad frontal system. Here's a prime example I'll give you guys. I was fishing a Bassmaster Invitational down at Table Rock Lake years ago, and it was a March tournament. Fish were on a jerkbait big time. You guys know I love to fish a jerkbait, and it was one of those deals where I didn't even need to practice. I mean, I knew what I was going to do. I knew how I was going to do it. I was fishing a mega bass jerkbait on main lake points. I knew how the fish were setting up. The first day of practice that I had, I'd roll up to a point and I'd catch one and they'd have all 3 hooks in their mouth. You had to take pliers to get all 3 hooks out of their mouth. And then I'd go 4 or 5 points down. I wouldn't fish 4 or 5 points. I'd hit another point, catch another 3 or 4 pounder, had to take all 3 hooks out of its mouth. Second day of practice, I was running the same pattern in a different part of the lake. And instead of getting all 3 hooks in their mouth, I would have 1 or 2 hooks in their mouth the second day of practice. And that went on all the course of all that second day. The last day of practice, it even got worse. I'd have some fish nipping at it. I'd have some fish hooked in the back hook. And those fish were reacting to the fishing pressure because everybody was running the same type of water. And in the tournament, I wound up having a good tournament, but probably 90% of the fish I caught in the tournament, they were hooked by 1 barb in the back hook. And instead of all 3 of those like they were the fish first day of practice. Now, that goes back to what you're saying. How would you have practiced for that? You don't have a control on what other anglers are doing in the tournament. That's why in some situations you can burn an area because you know that other anglers are going to get in there, and some areas you have to lay off them if you don't know there's going to be a lot of anglers in there. And I'll use one other quick example here. Let's go to Lake Okeechobee, on the North Shore at Lake Okeechobee, where you have these vast grass flats where it's a zoo, where you have boats everywhere around, everybody's fan casting, in these particular grass flats. They're there every day of practice. They're every day of the tournament. In a situation like that, it doesn't make any difference because it's not like you can catch a limit of fish and say, I'm going to save these fish for later on in the tournament. There's going to be somebody else catching them. So a lot of it, how you practice and how you spend your time in practice, it depends on the uncontrolled variables of other anglers in the tournament too. So always consider that. Never underestimate the impact fishing pressure has on the behavior of a bass as far as how they strike.
So one question there for you then, Randy, is do you feel like catching those fish the first day of practice where they were choking the bait, they had all 3 hooks in the mouth, was that helpful information to you, or would that potentially hurt you more than help you in the sense that you caught them so well the first day in practice that you're, oh man, look, they're ripping this crankbait, I caught all these fish, and maybe you have more experience and you also have 3 days of practice, but let's just say for an average fisherman, if they have 1 day of practice, and maybe it's not this Toyota series or this Bassmaster series where there's 100 guys practicing for a week straight, but just for let's say guys are fishing the day before, they could rip them on a crankbait in practice, and then if the next day it could go post front and those fish get really picky, just catching those fish on a crankbait when they're choking it hurt you more than help you if the next day they're inactive. In my opinion, I feel like you're almost better off never catching those fish on the crankbait, not even having that in the back of your head, and then going tournament day and figuring out, hey, the crankbait's not working, I'm going to give up on it very quickly, and then picking up a jig and catching fish on a jig. I honestly think, especially for anglers who have experience on the water and have experience building patterns and catching fish, getting those crankbait bites will hurt you more than help you.
Yeah, definitely. So, and and that's the whole thing about it. It's like you just have to decide. You got to look ahead what the weather's going to do a little bit, because I mean, one of the comments we had here, I think from Mike, who was talking about you have to practice for the tournament instead of practice. That's a very good point. And I'll give you guys a good example of what we're talking about here. I was fishing a tournament. It was Lake Norman Bassmaster tournament, and it was the last day of practice. It was cloudy and rainy. Water temperature was about 70 degrees. And I went out and I started throwing a Zara spook around points and just started whacking them. I mean, it was so easy. Every point you got to, you'd have 2 or 3 good ones blow up on it every single point. And I looked at the extended weather forecast and I saw the first day of the tournament, it was going to be sunny with some north wind. I knew that was done. I mean, it's like I knew while I was catching those fish on the spook, it's just like, this is not going to work in the tournament. I've just got to figure out how to catch these fish in the tournament, and I'll locate them on this point. But what's going to happen after this weather comes through? And that's what you have to do all the time. I mean, you always have to, think ahead a little bit. Just because something's working now doesn't mean it's going to work the next day. And normally, if you can figure out how to make that adjustment, that's when you can, do some good.
For sure. Now, one other thing that I want to throw at you, Randy, and this is another kind of hypothetical situation, but let's say that we're over on Grand Lake. We use Grand Lake, guys, just because Brandy and I are both familiar with the lake, so this could apply to any lake, though, in the country. But let's say, Randy, that we're out here on Grand Lake, and you have no practice for a tournament. And for you like to fish up shallows. So let's say that you're over here in Drowning Creek, and the fish are setting up, and there's a bunch of fish on, these steeper docks, these secondary points back in these creeks, and that's where a lot of the fish are. And you roll into this pocket, and in practice, you found that you're catching a ton of fish off of these type of points and docks. But also, every other angler in the entire field also figured that out. So you have 75 boats that roll in here, or 20 boats, or however many boats it is, roll into Drowning Creek, and every single secondary point with docks has a boat on it. And you're now fishing around all these other anglers. Well, when I go out on my Catch 15 videos and stuff, I go out on days like a Friday or Saturday usually when there's bunch of other boats out there. It's not just me. I'm fishing in a crowd of people. And when I'm out there, I remember I fished did a Catch 15 video in Drowning Creek offshore. Every single good offshore spot in this area had like 2 boats on it. It was crazy. It was just covered up with boats. And because the fishing pressure was so tough, I basically just went around people. I just fished the water that was available, going to the gaps where no one else was fishing, and that's where I ended up catching my fish. There was a bunch of guys, for example, fishing way out here off this point or like over here on this point. Nobody was kind of in between in here, and I noticed that. So I started graphing in here, found a nice little brush pile, and caught a 6-pounder. I ran further down the lake to get away from the pressure, and I went through all this area, and there was a bunch of guys on these main lake points out here and secondary points. No one was set up on this little drop-off right here. There's actually a marina where guys were driving by, and people just ignored this, and I caught my fish there as well. And it's almost like having the boat pressure there. Going out the day of the tournament or the day of like a Saturday where there's a bunch of other anglers, it'll show you where everyone else is fishing, and you can almost choose to avoid those areas. And I think that's actually helped me in my challenges the last 2-3 months, in that there's always other anglers fishing a lot of the obvious stuff, but the places where I find my fish are where there's no other boats. And yes, it does take me extra time. Like on a beaver lake, there were like 35 or 40 boats up in this like 3-mile stretch of the lake. There were a ton of boats everywhere when I was fishing out here, and all the obvious banks and cover and everything was just completely covered up. So I had to find some really subtle, like sloping points like this closer to the bank, and I graphed and I found like a isolated 5 or 6 fish, and that's what allowed me to catch my fish. And the reason that those fish were biting is because they had no fishing pressure. No one was fishing by them. So do you think that with this whole idea of maybe not practicing for a tournament, do you see an advantage of maybe not getting dialed into the same thing that everyone else is fishing and being able to pattern less pressured water? Does that make sense what I'm trying to talk about?
Yeah. That's the whole thing about it. When you're talking about fishing pressure, it's all relative to what you're fishing as far as the cover that the anglers are fishing. If you're fishing a lake like Grand Lake, where you mentioned there, Johnny, and those anglers and the fish both are set up on those real obvious hard structure places, it's, unless you just want to pull in on somebody and start fishing, you can't. Fishing pressure like that is really, really difficult to deal with. If you're fishing on a different type of area that's got like offshore grass or lots of cover, it can absorb that type of fishing pressure. But man, it's one of the, and we'll get into fishing pressure a little bit more, but one of the things that you've got to realize is like, you've got to adapt to that. I mean, fishing pressure, when you're practicing for a tournament, you're trying to develop a game plan, you have to take how many boats are into an area in a big way, because the advantage of practice, if you're dealing with a high pressure situation where there's a lot of boats in, is sometimes you can key on the key bait that they want. And everybody, if you've got a lot of people in one particular area, unless you can pinpoint, just like what you said, like one little key drop that somebody else isn't fishing, if you've got to get in there and mix it up with somebody, you have got to come up with some type of a different approach. And a lot of people think, when they think, well, okay, I'm going to get in this area and I'm doing something nobody else is doing, they think in terms of like downsizing. And downsizing isn't always necessarily the way you want to go. I've seen the time when upsizing works better. It can be, a different profile. It can be a different color. It can be a different angle, different way that you work the bait, a different cadence. So that's the thing that's where practice will help you out in a heavily fished area, is identifying what's going to trigger those strikes in a heavily fished area. I see it all the time. I mean, any time that I've ever fished a tournament where there's a lot of pressure, there's always, normally what happens is if you've got an area where there's like 50, 75 boats fishing in a close area, normally you're going to have like 4 or 5 guys catch them good and everybody else just sort of struggles. That's the way it is. I'll use a tournament example, the Lake Toho, the Lake Toho Bassmaster Open we fished 2 years ago down there. I was fishing this big open flat, tons of guys in there, everybody throwing a lipless crankbait and a jerkbait. I don't know why they were fishing a jerkbait, because 3 years before that, nobody ever threw a jerkbait down there, but some reason they were all throwing a jerkbait. And I came in there and I was fishing the same water, mixing it up with everybody else, and I wound up finishing in the top 15 in the tournament, changing to a black jerkbait. Nobody else was fishing one like that. Everybody was fishing a golden shiner type color in that particular water, thinking they bite golden shiners in Florida. But just something as simple as a color alteration in a heavily fished area can make all the difference.
So it's interesting, Randy, because that was a different response than I was expecting you to say. And what I'm realizing now is that the reason that I feel like maybe these theories aren't sticking with you as well as I was thinking they were going to is because our fishing styles are so drastically different. I think I'm realizing this now, as you said that last comment, in the fact that you don't mind mixing it up with other anglers, getting in the same area with other guys, and trying to dial in the bait, dial in the perfect technique and pitching, the perfect bait. I think that that's kind of your style. You'll get in those shallow water areas, bump boats with other guys, and like dial it in. Where for me, I hate doing that. And what I do is I use my electronics to find isolated schools of fish or fish away from everyone else. And I think that's why maybe practice for a shallow water angler may actually be very beneficial as opposed to like me, who I fish mainly offshore with my electronics. I feel like I can actually catch fish without practice better because I use my electronics to determine what the fish are doing on a given day. And I'm also able to find fish that are unpressured by other anglers. I can basically just go out there, see where everyone else is fishing, and just go somewhere else. That's kind of almost what I do when I go to the lake. I like when there are more boats out there because for me, it just tells me where I shouldn't be fishing. And
yeah, and that's the thing about it. It's like all you guys that are watching tonight, you guys know that Jonny and I we're 180 on how we approach fishing technique wise. It both works. Sometimes one works better than the other. But Jonny, you're fishing for a completely different type of bass than I am. I mean, the bass that the difficult part of how you fish and the approach that you use to your bass fishing is locating the fish, because you're locating these areas and these groups of fish that are difficult for most anglers to find. And a lot of times, while the technique, it can be real technique specific once you find these fish, because I've heard you telling me a lot of times they only wanted one particular technique, even though there was a group of group of bass down there. But a lot of times, the difficult part of what you have to do is finding these bass, these groups of bass. And once you find those bass, sometimes they can be easy to catch. But the bass that I fish for are the ones that they may be easier to find than the ones that you're finding, but they're highly educated, and they require in order to get these bass to strike, it requires a lot of creativity and different approaches on lures and colors and angles and techniques. And like I said, and both can be highly effective depending upon the time. But every lake out there has got two different populations of fish. They got the type of fish that you look for out off the bank in the subtle areas, and they've got the ones that I look for that are on the more obvious targets, but sometimes really finicky and more weather sensitive a lot of times.
And so if we want to relate that back to, because we kind of saw a comment here from Dan, and I am getting there, Dan, about getting back to the average angler. A lot of this has kind of been focused on tournament practice, but for the average weekend angler who gets to go out, and the idea that I'm trying to get across here is that you don't necessarily need to go out and practice for 3-4 days before a fishing trip to go catch fish effectively. That's not the case at all. But there is a specific technique and specific strategy you need to employ if you're going out the day of with no preconceived notions to how to catch those fish. And what I've just learned from Randy and kind of my theory on this is that if you're going to try to catch fish up in shallow water, up in 1, 2, 3 feet of water down the bank, the thing you need to focus on is going to the high percentage areas that are the best looking stretches of areas and throwing a unique presentation. So you need to really focus on really probably just maximizing your time in the most obvious looking areas, but throwing a bait that's different from what everyone else is throwing. Because that's what Randy's doing a lot in his practice. He's finding the obvious areas, but then when all the fishing pressure is there, he needs to throw a unique bait to get those fish to bite. On the flip side, when I go out and fish, I can go out without any practice and just find them because I'm using my electronics. When I was out on Beaver Lake the other day, I spent 5.5 hours of my 8-hour day driving the boat around, like graphing. I think actually I only was out there for 7 hours, so I think I was only 4.5 hours. I had the percentages down. I think it's 4.5 hours of my day graphing and then like 2.5 hours fishing. So what I was doing though is I was graphing with my electronics to find those fish, and that's the way I was able to dissect the lake. I covered how much water is this? I started my day down here by this bridge, down here, and I ended up graphing all the way up here. So this was 7 miles straight line. So that's probably about like 13 miles with all the curves and everything up to this part of the lake. So I graphed for 13 miles of water to find my fish. And I was basically just going to areas where there were no fishing pressure, no other boats fishing, and I graphed and I found my fish with my electronics. And I feel like if you really want to be effective finding fish day of, you either need to be really good at using your electronics and graphing and locating fish that other anglers aren't fishing for, or you need to be really good at quickly adapting your bait selection. Because that's kind of what Randy's talking about with his practice periods. He's spending most of his practice not necessarily finding the fish or finding the pattern, but finding the right bait and the right technique. That's really the key to being effective up shallow. And I feel like personally it's harder to get the correct bait and the unique bait right, because that's a little bit more based up to chance. Versus with the electronic stuff I do, Randy, I think I'm more consistent just going out and fishing day of, because I'm finding fish that aren't as hard to catch. They're just hard to find, and I've just perfected the art of finding them quickly. And I think that that's really something that if you guys want to be a really good angler with limited time to practice, if you just want to go catch them the 1 or 2 days you can fish a month, you have to master finding fish that other anglers are not fishing for. And the way to do that is with your electronics. And that's what I always teach on my main Fish the Moment channel, but it really, really is important. What do you think, Randy?
Yeah, and that's the great thing about bass fishing. It's like there's, you can fish the way that you like to fish, and there's a lot of different options to catch them. I mean, there are some lakes that are more conducive to both techniques than others. Like, say for example, if you're fishing a place like the Mississippi River oxbows, or the Mobile Delta or the Louisiana Delta, yeah, your techniques are going to be relegated to a dozen shallow water patterns. But if you're fishing the typical man-made impoundment, I don't care if it's 5,000 acres or 50,000 acres, you're going to have, like I said, those group of fish that live where Jonny likes to fish. You're going to have the group of fish that live where I like to fish. Not that we don't do both, because Jonny, he can fish a shallow as good as anyone else, and I can fish offshore too. But everybody has ways they like to catch them. I mean, they have ways that it's in their wheelhouse. And you need to become a well-rounded angler. I mean, that will benefit you in so many ways to be able to do everything. But at the same time, if you don't want to do that and you want to spend your Saturday just having a good time fishing the way you want to do it, I mean, just choose how you want to fish and look for those type of fish.
Yeah, I really do feel like, I guess, more even than what I expected. Honestly, I feel like there's almost 2 different approaches you can take if you want to be a good tournament angler. Because one of the things we talk about is like number one mistake tournament anglers make. You either, if you're going to fish up shallow, you almost need some practice time to really dial in the baits and the certain stretches that are going to be effective, it seems like. The more practice time you have, potentially it could help you catch fish, versus with the electronics aspect of it, maybe you don't need as much practice if you're confident that you can find the fish day of, if you can spend your time graphing and you're willing to do that. I think that there's more nuance to that there as well. But the big thing I think that a lot of anglers make, the mistake they make, is that they still get caught up in their practice way too much. They go out, catch a big bag of fish in practice, and then struggle during the tournament because they're not adapting to the conditions. They're not just like fishing the moment, and it's just kind of tricky because I feel like that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of guts to maybe abandon what you did in practice, give up control, and just let yourself go and fish the moment. Because that's what I do when I'm doing these challenges, these Catch 15 challenges, and I'm just so much more effective. I feel like I can catch them so much more consistently without having any preconceived notions, and I feel like that's something that you could tap into. I just don't know if it's as effective up shallow because I'm doing it all with electronics. I may have to just test it and do some Catch 15 where I only fish up shallow and see if it works out as well, because that's something that may, be the deal.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I learned about tonight's deal we've done here, is because Jonny has always told me how good he does with no practice. And it's like I've got to have practice. And I think that we've identified why that is, because for me, it's about cadence, it's color, it's the profile, the bait, that type of stuff. But one of the things I found out, like the way Jonny fishes, it's like if you take Jonny right now and you put him on Table Rock Lake or any lake around the country, he's going to spend his day graphing, and he may go for 5 or 6 hours with not even fishing, not catching a fish, but he's going to roll up on that point or that ditch at some point. It could be the first hour, it could be 5 or 6 hours in the day, and he's going to find him there and catch him. Whereas I have to get into an area and I have to locate the fish and I have to figure out how to catch these bass, in a real subtle way. So I remember one of the challenges that we fished down at Table Rock Lake. I was cranking shallow and Jonny was fishing deep. And I think that you went for like 6.5 hours without a bite and just idling. And then like the last hour or something, he found this one point that was loaded and beat me after I was catching fish all day long. But it took him 30 minutes to catch him once he found it. That's just sort of the way those two approaches work.
For sure. And one question here is Russell says, how do you get good with electronics? The way you do that is check out the Fish the Moment YouTube channel. Just go to my channel. I literally have huge playlists about fish finders, how to interpret fish finders, settings, what to look for, what everything means, how to apply it on the water. My whole YouTube channel, Fish the Moment YouTube channel, is dedicated to offshore fishing with electronics. So if you want to learn, go there. I document everything I do over there the best I can. Randy's got his channel for shallow water fishing with a lot of good tips there. Randy Block Intuitive Angling, so you can check it out there. And you can just watch the live stream. But one thing I do want to clear up here in the comments is Dustin is saying that if you fish deep in Oklahoma, you'll get beat every time. Dustin, that is not even close to being true, and I've kicked Randy's butt fishing offshore in Oklahoma more than a few times in our challenges. He's beat me up shallow as well, but there are offshore fish in Oklahoma. Grand Lake, Lake 10 Killer, Lake Hudson, I've caught them offshore, Fort Gibson, Texoma. There's so many lakes, even the shallow, muddy water lakes. There's a ton of fish offshore. You just have to know how to find them. They're not deep offshore. They're not in 25, 30 feet of water at times. Sometimes they're only 5 to 12 feet offshore, but you can catch them offshore year-round deep in Oklahoma. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, you definitely can, and you can't win a tournament down there at Grand Lake this time of year unless you are fishing offshore deep.
Yeah.
Now, 30 years ago, it was the other direction. I mean, it's like nobody fished out deep. If you weren't fishing a crankbait or flipping a jig up on the bank, you weren't going to win. But times have changed for sure.
For sure, yeah. It's one of those things that with the electronics, you have the ability to find these untapped fish, these fish that haven't been found, and that's what I like to always try to show on my channel is these untapped fish, these unique patterns using electronics. And actually, I'm getting my boat redone completely, Randy, with new electronics. I'm actually going to do a setup where I'm going to be able to switch out like all these different brands of fish finders. I have so many fish finders stacked up over here where I'm going to be running them. I'm not going to run them all at once, guys. Don't worry. I'm not going to the dark side. But like I'm going to have a 9-inch Humminbird Helix, and then I'm going to have a 9-inch Lowrance Hook 2, and then a 9-inch Lowrance Elite FS. These like different levels of units. And I want to show you what you can do with each of these different tiers of units, the different quality, the price points, stuff like that. I also want to make videos on how to catch fish with live scope, without live scope, all that stuff. So if you guys want to know anything about electronics, go subscribe to the main Fish the Moment channel, and also subscribe to the Fish the Moment live channel here so you guys can get that information. So a couple other things real quick, guys. One thing, I want to do another shout out real quick to Jessica Eaton for winning the Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. So Jessica, just send us an email over at info@fishthemoment.com, and we'll have Bridgeford send you a case of Bridgeford beef jerky. And if you guys want to have a chance to win a case of Bridgeford beef jerky, 12 free packages of jerky, just go down below in the comments of this video and just leave a comment letting us know your best practice period you ever had for a fishing tournament that resulted in you not doing well in the tournament. So basically you had a crazy practice, you caught a bunch of fish, then you sucked the tournament day. Or vice versa, maybe a practice day where you didn't catch a single fish, but you went out in the tournament, made some adjustments, and really caught them. Let us know either of those situations if they happened, and if you haven't fished tournaments before, just let us know your craziest or best fishing day story, and you'll be entered in to win a case of Bridgeford beef jerky. So that's super helpful. And yeah, that's pretty much it, Randy. Anything else before we sign off for the night?
No, just thanks again, guys. Appreciate you all taking a few minutes out or an hour or so out of your evening to check it out, man. And I hope you guys will join us next week also.
For sure. Definitely stay tuned. We're going to be doing actually live stream number 100, the 100th live stream, Randy, next week. I'm trying to line up a special guest or something. I need to do something special for episode 100, so definitely tune in next week. There's probably going to be some sort of big giveaway. I'm going to do something for episode 100 that's pretty big, so I'll announce it on social media and stuff too, and on the YouTube channel, so just be on the lookout for that. But that is pretty much it. Oh, one thing, Randy, they do need to say that, they did say that you need to teach people how to use the flasher. They need a flasher video from you, Randy. So that needs to...
I would love that. I could probably do just as well with the flasher on my boat today as I could with the sonars I got. Yeah, I appreciate that, Bill. That's a good idea.
Yeah, we're gonna get a flasher in your boat. Honestly, that just needs to happen already. I'm surprised you don't have one already, but we need to hook you up with one.
I think David Fritz is the only guy that still's got one on his boat, doesn't he? Doesn't he still have that old Eagle on his boat?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. It was probably the same one he used from 1996. So
I remember the old Hummingbirds I had. Guys, those things would vibrate so hard they'd shake the front of your boat. They were so loud, and the whole unit would just vibrate when you turned it on.
That's awesome. Good deal, guys. Well, hey, appreciate everyone tuning in tonight. Excited to keep doing more live streams. There's a lot of cool video content coming to the main Fish the Moment channel and Randy's channel, Randy Block Intuitive Angling. So definitely check out those channels. And other than that, guys, we'll see you next week, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, for another live stream. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you all next week.